currently, we're bringing in between 300 and 350,000 new Canadians every year, and we believe that's unsustainable. So my name is Alexander Murphy. I'm the People's Party of Canada candidate for Peterborough-Kawartha in the upcoming federal election on October 21st. I'm 27. I was born in Toronto and raised there. I went to high school there as well. I moved to Peterborough in 2010 to attend Trent University, where I studied history. I've since graduated with a bachelor's degree, and I'm also currently working towards a master's of business administration through the University of Fredericton. Additionally, I'm currently attending Fleming College for construction engineering technology because I aim to eventually start my own construction business. If I don't win on October 21st.
Backup plans.
Exactly, Plan B, that's right. A little bit more about myself. I was a member of the Trent University Emergency First Response Team at the university, so I was providing emergency first response care to students at the university. And I was looking for further ways to serve my community, so in 2012 I signed up to be an officer in the Canadian Armed Forces, and I'm currently serving as a captain at the Ontario Regiment in Oshawa, Ontario. It's an armored reserve unit down there. I've served overseas. I did one tour in Kuwait as a member of Joint Task Force Iraq, which was the Canadian contribution to the fight against Daesh, and I worked in the headquarters there. I've also served on Operation Provision, which was the domestic contingent of the Canadian effort to bring refugees to Canada. So we were helping to facilitate their transition into the country. I am self-described as, I think an economic libertarian would best, classically liberal, or classic liberalism would best describe me and my political views. I believe in individual freedoms. I believe in personal choice, the ability for people to have that freedom of choice, smaller government, less regulations. But I also believe in treating everybody equally. I believe that all citizens are equal. I believe that the government shouldn't make any laws respecting one particular identity over the other, because all Canadians are equal.
So tell me a little bit about the People's Party of Canada, because it is kind of the newest participant in Canadian politics right now. It's a brand new party, so why don't you tell me a little bit about the party and what it stands for?
So the People's Party of Canada started when Maxime Bernier felt that the Conservative Party no longer accurately represented conservative Canadians. We feel that the Conservative Party has moved further to the left and is more in a center position, and even Andrew Scheer self-describes as a pragmatic centrist party now. And so we feel that we needed a political party to represent those conservative Canadians who wanted a voice in Parliament. We took traditional conservative values and we've included our economic libertarianism in those values, such as things like abolishing supply management to ensure that Canadians have freedom of choice in the products that they buy. Lower taxes while also shrinking the size of the government to ensure that we're responsibly spending Canadians' money. Federal government is supposed to be, and any government for that matter, is supposed to be a steward of the taxpayer money, and that's one of the core principles that we have. Our four founding tenets are individual freedoms, personal responsibility, fairness, and respect, and we use those four core tenets to develop all of our policies and all of our decisions.
Okay, so let's start talking policies then, and I think probably the biggest portfolio that we can be talking about here in Peterborough, or one of the biggest ones I should say, is just in regards to the housing market right now. I think that Peterborough is dealing with there's a lot of data and information out there to prove that we have a very inhospitable housing market, especially for the city's most vulnerable people. So what would a PPC government do to try and deal with that situation?
That's a really great question, and I think it's important to a lot of people in this riding because of the skyrocketing housing prices that we're witnessing. But the first thing that the People's Party of Canada would do is to ensure that Canadians in general have more money available to them. by lowering taxes, by simplifying the tax process down from 5 brackets to 2. First of all, by increasing the personal tax exemption, income tax exemption to $15,000, we're going to save people $529 a year right off the bat. Then in addition, any income earned between $15,000 and $100,000, people are going to save $2,163 per year. So between those changes right there, we're saving people potentially thousands of dollars that they can then put towards housing. They can more easily afford the basic necessities of life, such as milk, milk, poultry, and eggs, if we abolish supply management, which costs the average family up to $500 more per year because we are dictating the price to Canadians rather than enabling a free market and open competition. And the unfortunate thing about supply management especially is it represents the equivalent of a 2.3% tax on the incomes of the poorest 20% of Canadians. And so if we abolish supply management, if we simplify the tax system, if we cut government spending, we can ensure that Canadians have more money available to them to spend on housing. And those are the kinds of policies that have a collateral effect on the housing market that we can actually implement at the federal level without interfering in provincial jurisdictions in their development of their own housing plans. Because one of the problems with a national housing strategy is that it ignores the geographically specific socioeconomic factors that you may see in a difference between, as an example, Moncton and Peterborough. What works for Moncton might not work for Peterborough, and vice versa, especially when we look at things like the average housing price in Moncton, and this is a hypothetical arbitrary number, but let's say it's $120,000 for an average house in Moncton, but it's $500,000 for an average house in Peterborough. You're going to have to look at different strategies to address that issue. You're going to have to look at different strategies to enable Canadians to afford that housing. And simply talking about building more units is not going to adequately address that issue. That's why some of those other collateral effects that we can have on the housing market are decreasing the demand. When we look at the current immigration policy, and this is one of the most contentious policies we have as the People's Party of Canada, currently we're bringing in between 300 and 350,000 new Canadians every year, and we believe that's unsustainable. The demand for housing is rapidly outpacing the supply. And especially when approximately half of those new Canadians are settling in Toronto and Vancouver every year, those are some of the most inflated and highest cost housing markets in the country. And then we wonder why the housing prices continue to increase. Well, it's because the demand is outpacing the supply. And the surrounding communities of both Toronto and Vancouver, and Peterborough is an excellent example, feel the ripple effects of that because people with money from Toronto try and move out of the city to the surrounding areas so that they can afford housing, and they bring that money with them, and that drives the housing prices up in those surrounding communities. And so we've gone from a national level policy talking and a frank conversation we need to have about immigration to housing affordability in Peterborough. And these are the conversations that we need to have in order to affect housing.
So just talking about the immigration and housing, so from my understanding, with the number of boomers that are going to be exiting the workforce and retiring, we simply don't have enough workers to fill those roles naturally. So Canada relies on immigration to kind of fill that gap. So how do we go about, if to alleviate the housing market, cutting down on immigration, when part of our economy is going to be relying on immigrants?
Sure, but we've gone past the point of fulfilling our economic needs, and we've now more than doubled it. So if we look at the immigration rates per capita of all European and Western nations, we have about double the per capita rate of all of those other countries. And so when we're talking about bringing our proportional rates in line with them, that's about 100 to 150,000 new Canadians every year. That is a sustainable rate of immigration that still fulfills our economic needs, especially when we want to increase the proportion of skilled immigrants in that number. So currently it's about 26%, which will be the equivalent of between 60 and 70,000 skilled immigrants coming into the country every year. We want to raise that to 50%, which will bring in at least 75,000 new Canadians with required skills every single year. So we're actually helping to address that issue directly by reforming the immigration system, reforming the point system to examine the skills that are required for our economy and bring in those specific skills so that it suits our economic needs. And in general, it's better for new Canadians as well because they are better able to immediately integrate into the economy if they have those skills that are in demand. If they have the ability to sustain themselves immediately upon entering the country, then they rely on fewer government services and it decreases the cost to the government as well.
So, how much does immigration play in raising the prices in the Canadian housing market? Because I was reading a Financial Post report that was saying that the impact appears to be an increase in prices of less than 1%. Is that what your party is seeing, or?
I haven't seen that report. I can't comment on a report I haven't seen, but all of the evidence that we've been looking at, immigration is not exclusively responsible for the housing market. We're not trying to say that. Nobody is arguing that, but it does play a significant role in the increase of housing prices. Again, not 100% of it, but it does play a role in it, and especially in the surrounding communities.
I don't think you're wrong about calling that part of your plan contentious. I've seen some people who have said that the PPC's plan to cut immigration is xenophobic. What is your response to that?
I think that people who label our party as xenophobic for our immigration policy fall under one of two categories. First, they don't know what xenophobia is, or second, they're using it disingenuously and dishonestly because they can't actually debate our ideas. Like I mentioned earlier, our per capita immigration rates are double that of nearly every single other European and Western nation. And so to suggest that we are xenophobic for wanting to bring our immigration rates in line with all of our partners and allies would also be to suggest that every single other Western and European nation is also xenophobic. It's an inane argument that is attempting to undermine an honest discussion that we need to be able to have.
Okay. Is there anything else about the housing market and the PPC's plan for housing that you want to add before we move on to the next topic?
Sure, there's a couple of other things that can have collateral effects on the housing market, one of which is the capital gains tax. We want to eliminate the capital gains tax and phase it out over a number of years. One of the reasons that we want to do this is a capital gains tax disincentivizes investment, whether that be through capital investment in things like the investment market, or also, for example, with landlords. They are disincentivized to buy further houses because as long as it's not their primary residence, anytime they sell that unit or sell that apartment or building, they have to pay a capital gains tax on it, whereas if it's your primary residence, you don't. But if we get rid of the capital gains tax, it'll incentivize more people to invest in the housing market to bring rental units to availability, which will increase the number of rental units for people. And then when we look at things like lowering their basic costs, removing the carbon tax to decrease the price of heating homes, then we are also going to enable landlords to lower their rental prices because their costs are lower. So they can maintain that margin, the profit margin, if they have lower costs but also lower rent.
Okay. Let's move on to the next topic. Let's talk about something that is also gripping our community and something that is taking lives in our community, and that is the opioid crisis. Obviously, we've seen record number of deaths here in our community due to the opioid crisis. So what is the PPC's plan to be dealing with that?
The PPC does not have a national plan for this issue, and I'll kind of segue a little bit into our party's policy of individuals coming up with policies that best suit their local ridings. And the party leadership has left it up to the candidates to determine and propose policies based on what they're seeing in their local communities. We're going to have a whip in name only, and that's one of the freedoms that we have as candidates in the PPC is to come up with policies that best suit our communities. And one of the ideas that I'm proposing, and some of the other candidates are proposing as well, is a decriminalization of possession of simple substances or illicit substances, right? So it would enable us to treat drug addiction as a medical issue and not a criminal issue. And this is one of the key concepts that has been shown to work in decreasing rates of drug use in several different countries, two prominent of which are Switzerland and Portugal. Now, they have varying differences in the way that they apply their models, but I want to see an adoption of the Portuguese model, which, again, not only decriminalized simple possession of those illicit substances, in their medical treatment of the drug addiction, they take a holistic approach to that person's life. And they address familial issues, they address economic issues, they address social issues, mental health issues, all of these factors which combine to perpetuate drug addiction. And so if we can treat all of those different factors by sending the addict in front of a social worker, a lawyer, and a doctor to come up with a plan for rehabilitation, we can better reintegrate that person into society, and they are less likely to use again.
So sorry, continue.
Well, and just on that note of using again, when we criminalize drug addiction and they end up incarcerated, when they leave that incarceration, they have a criminal record, which means it's more difficult to find housing, it's more difficult to find a job, and as a result, they are more likely to end up using again.
Okay. So what does connecting them with doctors and counselors, what shape does that take place? Is that just, instead of police officer taking someone and charging them, is that taking them to some kind of counseling service, or is that a treatment facility here in Peterborough? Like what kind of shape does that take place in your eyes?
There's a couple of different things that would have to happen, and it would require an integration of many different services, including police and emergency medical services, as well as the social system that we have. It's going to require facilities such as drug treatment facilities, rehabilitation facilities. It's also going to include safe injection sites, which are desperately needed.
That was my next question,
safe
too.
Injection sites are only a sliver of the solution. They are one part of a larger network that is required nationwide in order for this model to function. And in Portugal, they implemented it, and they found exactly the same thing. Safe injection sites exclusively don't work on their own, but need to be a part of a larger solution. And so in most of their cities, they constructed facilities that are dedicated to addictions treatment. And ideally, as the addictions treatment commences and this program commences and drug addiction decreases, you can eventually scale back some of those programs to deal with a maintenance level rather than our initial level.
Okay. And where does, when you talk about things like, treatment and consumption sites, is that federal funding that comes down, and then the kind of local MPs kind of have some authority on how to spend it, or what does that look like?
So one of the proposals that we have, and one of the concepts that we want to reinforce is the Constitution and the jurisdictions laid out in the Constitution. So similar to the way that healthcare is organized, we've got a National Healthcare Act, which sets out the kind of baseline requirements for healthcare nationwide, but it also sets out the fact that the provinces are ultimately responsible for implementing their own individual programs per province. And so we would look at this sort of through the same lens, where we would implement an act nationwide stating that the provinces were going to implement their own provincial policies for enforcement and treatment and these kinds of things. And that would also enable them to better integrate that treatment system into their pre-existing healthcare systems, because ultimately those two would have to work together. Mm-hmm. And so we would end up with a significant conflict if we were trying to implement that kind of program at the federal level in contrast against the provincial systems. That's why we want to leave it up to the provinces to ultimately decide how they go about creating this system, but we would provide the guiding principles for it.
Okay, so delegate that to the provinces. Sure. And let them kind of create the infrastructure or work within the infrastructure they already have.
Exactly. And ultimately the first step is a federal issue, which is the decriminalization of simple possession, which is a part of the criminal code and therefore a federal jurisdiction.
Okay. And is there any funding attached to that to that kind of delegation down to the provinces if the provinces said, okay, if Ontario decided, okay, we want to start opening consumption sites in select communities, is there funding attached to that from the federal government to support them?
So as a part of our enforcement of the jurisdictions for the Constitution, or as per the Constitution, what we want to do is scrap the GST. And we want to give that tax room, which is about 5% right now, to the provinces, which means they will be able to directly tax that money rather than going to the federal government for it. Not only does it decrease the bureaucracy that currently exists, where Canadians pay taxes to the federal government, who only then turns around and gives it to the provincial governments, it'll decrease that bureaucracy, but it'll also ensure that the provincial governments can be held individually accountable for how that money is spent in that province, rather than turning this healthcare funding issue into a federal election issue every 4 years, which I think ultimately confuses the problem, and it takes some of the attention away from the fact that we have to have provincially specific healthcare programs in order to address provincially specific healthcare issues. One of which would be things like opioid addiction, where it's going to vary from province to province. And so the provinces need to be able to directly fund those programs themselves.
All right. I think that about wraps up our discussion on the opioid crisis. So let's take a short break and come back to it, and we'll go again in the other half.
Sounds good.
All right, perfect. Thanks. So let's go in the second half now, and let's talk about a couple of more issues that are going to be kind of important to our community, and let's talk about climate change, because we've been given this kind of dire warning from the UN that we have at this point around 10 years to kind of curb our emissions. But I'll leave it with you. What is the PPC's stance on climate change?
Sure. Well, the first thing that I wanted to address was part of your question there, where the UN is kind of giving us these dire warnings. Some of them range from we've only got 12 months to live to 11 years. It varies. But I think what comes out of that is a sense of hysteria, a sense of alarmism, and a sense of panic, none of which are good sentiments when you're trying to come up with good policy. Panic leads to rash decision making, and rash decision making ignores good plans. It ignores an analysis of the situation that enables us to develop a suitable plan for our country. And part of the problem that we're looking at now is organizations like the IPCC, who by their own admission cannot accurately, even remotely accurately, predict the future based on their models. And it's in there in both the 2007 and the 2018 IPCC report. And the conclusion is that, and I'm paraphrasing, but they cannot accurately predict future weather and climate conditions based on computer modeling. And so a lot of these apocalyptic predictions are inappropriate, and they breed panic, yet they're mostly baseless. What we need to do is focus on practical solutions that we can implement here in Canada that suit the context that Canada finds itself. For example, Canada produces only 1.6% of the total greenhouse gas emissions in the whole world. Well, what do we hope to achieve with even a 30% reduction in those emissions? Is that going to change the global climate? No, it's not. It's going to have a less than 1% reduction in total emissions. So we need to develop a plan that actually makes sense for Canada, and that's going to include things like lowering emissions through nuclear energy. We have a vast, cold country that requires electricity. It requires fossil fuels. And so we need a clean method of creating energy for those electric homes, while also facilitating the clean transportation of petroleum. That's going to come from nuclear energy. It's clean, it's safe, it's reliable. We can bring it anywhere in the country. We can decentralize our grid, which will have collateral effects such as increasing the resistance against cyber attacks and outages. We need to focus on powering our grid in such a way that it's not producing emissions. And unfortunately, renewable energy resources are unreliable. They're also harmful to the environment. When we look at the production of solar panels and wind turbines, the pollution from those manufacturing processes is significant, and it's scary, to be quite honest. A lot of the chemicals and emissions from those production plants are harming the environment. They're having a direct negative impact. At least 10% of wind turbine blades are non-recyclable, which means at the end of their life cycle, they have to be buried in the ground. Well, that's not environmentally friendly. Whereas with nuclear energy, the life cycle of the plant can be potentially up to 200 years, depending on the design. We can make them small and decentralized and scalable to our energy requirements. And it doesn't matter whether the sun is shining or whether the wind is blowing, they can produce electricity. And most importantly, they're emissions free. So we're lowering our carbon emissions by transferring our energy grid over to nuclear. The second thing that we need to focus on is climate mitigation. Okay, it's fantastic that we're going to all hold hands and sing Kumbaya and lower emissions worldwide together. But we don't actually have direct control over any other nation. And so we need to plan for the worst and hope for the best. And the plan for the worst is that the climate will continue to change and we will see significant detrimental weather effects and severe weather effects. Well, we need to plan for that. And so we need climate mitigation strategies, proper forest management to include forest fires as a healthy part of the forest life cycle. That's going to be proper floodwater management to ensure that we're being proactive about floodwaters and ensuring that we don't end up with cities with watersheds that immediately shed the water into the surrounding water systems, which results in floods. We need more water holding ponds. We need more marshland. All of these combine into being proactive about floodwaters. We need to look at air and water quality standards, as well as species preservation and conservation. Pollinators are an excellent example of a species in Canada that is severely threatened, whether it's the monarch butterfly or the honeybee, and yet they are essential for all life. Well, we need to focus on actually preserving those species. We need to focus on ensuring that polluters are strictly regulated. We need to have stronger criminal consequences for people who are polluting our water and our air. And we also need to abolish the carbon tax, quite frankly. It is ineffective. At its current prices, it's not having an effect on consumption. And we've seen this as evidenced in British Columbia, who has had a carbon tax for more than 10 years now. And a study just came out 2 weeks ago that showed between 2007 and 2017, there was a less than 1% drop in carbon emissions in that province. That is not lowering emissions, but it's increasing the price of essential items for people. Regardless of how expensive fossil fuels are, people still need to drive their cars and they still need to heat their homes. And the problem with putting a consumption tax on something like fossil fuels is that fossil fuels are an inelastic resource because there's no reasonably priced alternative available to people. And because they still require it for their everyday life, whether it is $1 per liter or $3 per liter, if they need to heat their home, they need to heat their home, which means they're just going to end up paying more for the same amount. As a result, we need to look at a different strategy for Canada. A carbon tax is not going to work, especially when we only have 1.6% of total emissions worldwide. It might work for some of the world's largest producers, like the United States, like China, like India, but they also have different climates than we do. Right? The climate in Saskatchewan in the middle of February is very different from the climate in Southern California, where they can afford and have reasonable alternatives than the basic requirement of keeping their house warm, of keeping their family alive. So does a carbon tax make sense for Canada? No, it doesn't. Lowering our emissions as per some arbitrary target set out by an international organization doesn't make sense for Canada. There's 190 countries on Earth. Why would we take a blanket approach to all 190 countries when there are significant varying factors all across the globe, whether or not it's factors such as poverty or development or even the basic climate of those individual countries. Peru is going to have a different climate approach than Canada is. So why are we treating them the same? And we shouldn't be. And that's the approach that the People's Party of Canada wants to take is we need to sit down, think about this rationally, think about this logically, and come up with a plan suitable for Canada.
So the past couple of weeks, I think we've seen a lot of climate change activism happening in Canada and in other countries as well. And there was something that was said by Greta Thunberg, who I forget the exact wording of what she said, but when she was speaking to the UN, I believe the gist of what she was saying was you're living in a fantasy world where you continue to see kind of upwards economic growth. Mm-hmm. So I guess that kind of springboards into my next question for you, which is, So, under the PPC's plans, who or what party is it that pays for climate change? Who pays for climate change under a PPC government?
In what context? I just want to get clarification on the question. What do you mean by who pays for it?
I mean, in terms of climate change policies, in terms of you had mentioned holding big polluters accountable. So is it big polluters that are paying to curb emissions, or
Well, no, I mean, in terms of holding big polluters accountable, I'm talking about actual fines and potential, prison terms for those that are being negligible or, negligent in their emissions and pollution. So if people are actively breaking the law in polluting in ways that they're not supposed to, that's when we need to take a stronger approach to them. It's protecting our air and our water by having strict criminal offenses for those actions, strengthening the Environmental Protection Act, strengthening monitoring agencies so that they can actually enforce the laws that already exist. But it's also looking at companies such as Nestle, for example, who is draining our freshwater for pennies on the dollar. Those are the kinds of companies that we need to look at to ensure the sustainability of our ecosystem because they're just exploiting it. With regards to, and I think I'll try and address your question as best I can, who's going to pay for it? A large number of the agencies and issues that I raised are at the federal level already, and we have no problem spending money on issues like that and on agencies like that. And I think it's a common misconception that when we talk about shrinking the government, it means cutting services like that. When we talk about shrinking the government and ensuring that the proper jurisdictions are paying for what they're supposed to be paying for, we want to cut redundant and egregious, unreasonable government spending. And I'll give an example. The 2017 federal budget, in the creation of the actual document itself, the Liberal government spent more than $212,000 just on the design of the cover page. That's the kind of spending that we're going to cut and redirect it towards practical solutions to our environmental issues, such as those agencies. Some of those agencies could do a lot of money or could do a lot of good with $200,000 extra in their budget every year, and yet we're spending it on frivolous things. So a lot of that climate change funding or the money that we need in order to address these issues, it already exists. We just have to spend it appropriately.
Okay. Anything else you want to add about that topic before we move on to our last one for the day?
Yes, pipelines. A lot of people conflate pipelines with this impending climate crisis. But the fact is that pipelines are emissions free. They don't produce GHG in their transportation of petroleum. Trucks, trains, and ships are some of the dirtiest possible methods of transporting that petroleum. So as a part of our environmental platform, we want to decrease emissions by building pipelines. You had mentioned this fantasy world of endless economic growth, as Greta Thunberg put it. Well, I think it's a fantasy world that we're not going to require petroleum for the foreseeable future. Even if we were able to switch our economy over to 100% electric vehicles tomorrow, you still need petroleum in order to produce those electric vehicles, in order to make the metal required to build the frames for the cars, in order to build the tires, our shoes, carpets, clothing, all of which require petroleum. And the safest and cleanest way of transporting that petroleum is via pipeline. When we look at total global emissions, shipping, as in using ships to transport oil, it contributes about 2% of our global emissions. Well, why are we trying to continue to increase that emissions by shipping our oil via ship instead of via pipeline? We have the oil in Canada already. It doesn't make sense to be buying it from across an ocean, especially from countries like Saudi Arabia, who have rampant human rights violations, So anybody that's not in favor of building a pipeline, as far as I'm concerned, they're in favor of buying oil from human rights violators and supporting those bloodthirsty dictatorships. It's a fact. If you're not buying Canadian oil, where are you getting it from? Well, you're getting it from human rights violators. We have the oil available to us in Canada already. We should be buying Canadian oil.
All right, let's move on to our last topic right now. It's not so much of an issue as it is kind of a social occurrence happening right now. But if you look at the state of politics right now, I think you can kind of chart over the past few years that politics has gotten kind of a bit messier, a bit more personal. There's a lot more kind of personal attacks that happen in politics now, and a lot more kind of social media barrages that happen from followers. So, what's your thought on the current state of politics as it sits right now?
I believe we have become hyper-partisan. We have become tribalist. It's very much adversarial rather than, I think, what our democracy was founded on, which was cooperation. Instead of coming together to find common ground, our current politicians insist on finding the issues that are most divisive, what differentiate us, rather than finding what unites us. And I think what we need are more parties on the political stage so that people can be better represented. If we have those more nuanced opinions and more nuanced representation, then it becomes easier for cooperation. What we want to see a reduction in is things like the supermajorities, but are made up of 39% of the actual popular vote. Well, that's not a majority. That's not accurately representing what Canadians need. And one of the things that we want to see is electoral reform. The 2015 Liberals promised it, and unfortunately they didn't deliver on it. They failed Canadians in that sense. Regardless of what the outcome of the referendum would have been, I don't have a stake in what particular electoral process we ended up with, and in all honesty, maybe we would have ended up with first past the post again. But Canadians deserve the opportunity to choose for themselves, and it shouldn't be, dictated to them what type of electoral system they have. It's been 152 years of a first past the post system. I think that is more than reasonable enough time to change it, and we need to give Canadians that opportunity.
Do you have a certain model in mind when it comes to electoral reform? Or
I mean, there's a couple of different models, right? And ultimately it would come down to, I think, recommendations from political scientists and economists and constitutional constitutional law experts, right? And their ability to come together and recommend potentially 4, maybe 5 options for Canadians. Whether it's a ranked ballot system, whether it's proportional representation, there are many different ones. And again, I don't have a particular recommendation or stake in any one of them. I just want the opportunity to choose for myself and be able to make that informed decision. And so far, we have not been afforded that opportunity, despite this being a democracy. And enough Canadians, I think, voted in 2015 to give the mandate for electoral reform, and yet that wasn't carried through. Well, we need to carefully examine that in this election and ensure that we're giving a government the mandate that actually is going to carry through on that decision, and we will. If we're elected and we form a government, then absolutely we're going to implement electoral reform. It's our responsibility, and that's the mandate given to us by the Canadian people. Why would we renege on that? Unless we look at things like the Liberal government's realization that it wouldn't suit their next election needs. Right? That's dishonest. It's underhanded, and it's disrespecting Canadians. And that's all a part of, leading back to your original question of what has politics become and what has our discourse become. It's all about being reelected now. It's entirely about what can I do to make sure my party ends up back in power in 4 years or 2 years or whenever the next election is going to be, rather than simply representing Canadians and their constituents. That's what we need from politicians. We need leaders who are adequately and professionally representing their constituents. We don't have that anymore. I mentioned to you earlier, before this interview, the quote from Catherine McKenna in the video, where she said, if you say it loud, if you say it often, if that's your talking point, Canadians will believe it. Well, it's not her job to be pushing a particular agenda, one especially that may be dishonest or maybe an outright lie. It's her job to reflect Canadian values and the will of the people. It's what we want to bring. We want to bring governed by the people for the people back to the people.
All right. I'll leave it off with you. Is there anything else that you want to add before we sign off?
There's a couple of issues that haven't really been talked about at length in this election, some of which are very important, especially for a federal election. The first of which is our military. I'm a soldier, and so I can see firsthand the effect of lowered funding. And we need to have a discussion about this, and nobody has been talking about it. The three questions, more or less, that you asked me, whether it's about housing, affordability, opioids, the environment, are kind of the first three questions that come up in every single debate. But foreign policy and our military hasn't shown up in any of them. And yet it's one of the main jurisdictions of the federal government. So why aren't we talking about this? And the fact is that we're not talking about it because none of the other parties want to talk about it. We are the only party that has a tangible and reasonable proposal for military. We want to be spending the minimum 2% of our GDP as required by our NATO obligation towards our military budget. We're spending, I think, a little less than 1% right now. Our forces are woefully underfunded. And even if you want to look at things like international emergency assistance or UN missions, when we stretch our armed forces as thin as they are now, they are not as adequately able to fulfill those missions that we want to conduct. And I don't think it matters whether or not it's an interventionist issue or humanitarian or whatever. We still need to have a strong military. We're going to have to buy the F-35 in order to integrate with our allies. It's a fact that moving forward, everybody else is going to have this aircraft. But it's not just about the aircraft, it's about the systems and the cooperation with our allies so that we can integrate with them. It's about the sensor systems that exist surrounding the aircraft so that we can share information. We also need to rebuild our Navy. Our Navy is in a dire state. And the government has completely disregarded it, and the Liberal government especially. And I'm not a partisan man, whether it's conservative or Liberals who've been in power, they've both disregarded our military. But the Conservatives went ahead with buying a supply ship, and then the Liberals tried to cancel it to the tune of $80 million. And that's the whole reason we had the Vice Admiral Mark Norman affair, is because he did what was in the best interest of the Navy and brought this to the public's attention, that we needed that supply ship and the Liberals were trying to cancel it. Well, we need to take a careful look at our Navy, and we need to spend a significant amount of money to rebuild it. But we can't do that unless we're going to have that conversation, unless we're going to bring it to the public's attention and ensure that they are thinking about the fact that they're ignoring the military right now. And Canadians are generally pretty apathetic towards our military at the federal level. They love to parade them out for events, but when it comes time to actually spending the money required to give them the equipment they need, they conveniently ignore that. And when it comes to the equipment we need to depoliticize our procurement process. Right now, every single government that has ever come into power is able to parade their spending decisions, right? Their procurement decisions. Oh, well, we bought the F-35, or we bought this ship, or we bought, this rifle. And it's all for easy political points rather than what we actually need in terms of equipment. We need a separate, depoliticized, nonpartisan committee that will determine procurement decisions so that our military is getting the best equipment, regardless of where it's made, regardless of what government is in power at the time. We need the best equipment. And the only way that we're going to get any of these changes is by talking about it.
All right. So we're out of time, but thank you so much for being on the show. I appreciate it.
Thank you. I appreciate you having me.